Welcome back to the album years. Yes, folks, we like albums. Not for us, the Spotify playlist or the best of, right, Tim? We like those deep cuts that no one else cares about these days. So myself, Stephen Wilson, and my co-host, Timothy Bowness.
Hello.
And Tim, today we are talking about 1985.
1985.
The year of Live Aid.
Indeed. Do you remember where you were?
I do remember exactly where I was. I was rehearsing with my heavy metal band Paradox while Live Aid was on. I remember that very, very well.
I was in Felixstowe with Robert Cox, the composer.
There you go. Well, rehearsing with a heavy metal band, hanging out with a serious composer. I'll leave you to decide who's cooler. So listen, I always had, sometimes you get that kind of idea in your head.
Yeah.
And it just becomes part of your personality, and it's very hard to disabuse yourself of this notion. And my notion about Live Aid was always that it killed the 80s.
Yeah.
That after Live Aid, music became worthy and a bit dull. But of course, it's not the case at all, is it? In fact, some of my favourite 80s albums came after Live Aid. Colour of Spring, Seeds of Love, Victorialand, Skylarking. But was there a sense that Live Aid was a bit of a sort of... I mean, it comes right in the middle of the 80s, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And there is... Correct me if I'm wrong, or if you feel differently, there is a sort of sense of the tide changing post-Live Aid, isn't there?
Well, 85, I was about to say, 84 to me and 83, a lot of this kind of post-punk era seemed like worlds of possibilities. And I remember being really excited by some albums in 84 in particular where I thought this can go further. And indeed it did, artists like Talk, Sylvian, Laurie Anderson, even Scott Walker.
Get them all in, Tim. Get all the drinking game favourites in straight away.
What I want is someone now with their whiskey. 1, 2, 3,
They're already
4.
drunk. They've gone already.
They've gone
passed
already
out.
at the beginning, which means they're going to enjoy it a lot.
Yeah.
But I thought that these artists were going to kind of progress. This was the future of music in some way. And 85, I remember at the time it feeling a little more dull, a little more mainstream. And Live Aid was the cherry on that mainstream cake. And that cake had a decoration of Phil Collins' grinning face on it.
Well, it's a bit unfair on Phil. We're going to talk about Phil later. But you see, it's funny, isn't it? Live Aid, everyone now remembers Queen, don't they, at Live Aid? But,
yeah.
And they were amazing. But I think that there was a more significant performance at Live Aid, one that kind of set
Led Zeppelin with Phil Collins?
No, not that one. One that kind of set the tenor for the rest of the 80s, and it's U2.
Okay.
Because I feel like after Live Aid, a lot of these bands wanted to be U2. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, and I think this is what I remember at the time. So I remember sort of doing auditions for bands. I remember getting in a band that were in Urmston, and they were U2 meets Simple Minds. And I turned this down because they were excellent musicians, really nice people, but they were a bit like Radiohead's impact in the late 90s. It was almost like every four-piece wanted to be U2 or maybe Simple Minds. And this was a good example of that, where as good as the music was, it was an absolute, homage to what was going on in the mainstream at the time, which was, U2 in a rock sense.
Yeah, I mean, lest we lead people to think otherwise. I mean, I love U2 and I love Simple Minds. But
and Unforgot the Fire was a great album in 84.
Joshua Tree is a masterpiece, I think. But and some of the Simple... We're going to talk about the Simple Minds album from this year, which I love too, Once Upon a Time. But there was a sense that they were the shiny new model that everyone aspired to, and it didn't always work out for everyone. Interestingly, I was just making some notes earlier about this year. There are a lot of the sort of seminal 80s bands didn't release albums in 85. They released albums in 84 and 86, but for some reason 85 is like a bit of a dead spot. Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, Culture Club, Ultravox, Depeche Mode, Human League, The Ham.
The Ham?
We've got nothing to talk about. We have to get him in anyway.
Yeah, nothing.
Nothing from The Ham, nothing from Bowie in
Gabriel.
85. Nothing from Gabriel.
Well, other than the soundtrack. I mean, the thing is, Gabriel and Sylvian did the soundtrack.
We are going to talk about the Gabriel soundtrack. But what I'm saying is a lot of the sort of quintessential 80s synth pop, new romantic bands, 85 didn't release anything.
It seemed dead. I remember that sensation living through it. It was almost like people spoke about 76 and 75 as in some ways... the whole kind of underground psychedelic jazz explosions of the 60s, early 70s, R&B even, had just kind of ossified into something more stately and more mainstream. And as I've said, I distinctly remember 85 feeling like that. And yet when I looked at the list, I realised I probably bought about 100 of these.
Yeah, ditto.
On vinyl mainly, cassette on a couple of occasions, because the Sylvian release was peculiar because it was only available on cassette at the time.
We're going to talk about those records later, but let's start with our rundown of 1985 then, Tim. Perhaps a much misunderstood year, at least if nothing else by us at the time. And we're going to start with the sort of mainstream, or the category that you've called Colossi, the big mainstream pop artists. Now, the first one on this list might be, in many ways, the quintessential 1985 album, not because of the music, not because of the band, but because of the format. Let me explain what I mean by that. Dire Straits, Brothers in Arms came out in 1985, a massive record, great record. But why is it significant? Because it was the first album to sell more than 1 million units on the shiny new format compact disc. And in a sense, that's interesting because 85 was a watershed moment for two reasons. Live Aid on one hand, and the fact that CD seemed to, over the course of this year, and I'm sure it's not as simple as this, but it seems like this in retrospect, CD seemed to become the dominant format in this year, taking over from vinyl. And Brothers in Arms was the first album that everybody buying their new CD player. Yeah. Of course, I'm generalising, but it felt like Brothers in Arms was the first album you would go and buy to show off your player.
On CD, because I kind of remember, because I didn't have CD player until 89, 90. And I think even I was ahead of the curve with a lot of my friends who were still very much in the vinyl and cassette territory. I kind of see the shift overwhelmingly to CD really by about 91, because if you think about it, by 1990, even 92, cassette was arguably the best-selling medium, actually, because cassettes were what people played in cars. So they were huge. But yeah, I think you're right, it was significant, and I think for whatever reason, that album became the one, a bit like Dark Side of the Moon was the thing you tested your hi-fi on in 83. Brothers in Arms.
73, Schoolboy Era number 1.
73.
Yeah.
Dark Side of the Moon, 1973, I know that.
I mean, it was still selling bucket loads in 83, to be fair. But yes,
now, obviously, as we know.
Yeah. And it's a good record. I mean, it is a record which is a kind of audiophiles record. It sounds beautiful. It's beautifully produced. It's beautifully recorded. It has great songs on it. Has great playing on it. But again, for me, it's slightly symptomatic of 1985 being more about worthy music than truly exciting, innovative music. And I'm a massive fan, for example, of the previous Dire Straits record, Love Over Gold.
I really like the previous one. And I think that was a great example of it was unexpected because it was a lot more ambitious, atmospheric,
conceptual,
unexpected, sensual. And and the single, Private Investigations, what a bizarre,
amazing
piece of work to be so big. And I remember being disappointed with this at the time. It had a much more orthodox sound.
Money for Nothing's a bit irritating, isn't it? It's a bit ZZ Top.
Yeah. It is ZZ
It's still being played. Yeah. I mean, to be fair, I think that's what they were going for, the kind of ZZ. They were trying to, tap into that ZZ Top demographic and did it very successfully. Of course they did too. So I think for me, as you say, I'm probably sure it's a lot more complicated than I remember, but it seemed to me like 85 was the year that we went from vinyl to CD. Mm-hmm. And as I say, it probably isn't as straightforward as that. And as you say, it probably took the best part of the next 5 years for that process to be completed. But it felt like that process began in earnest with albums like Brothers in Arms, particularly this record.
Everything felt more staid, more responsible, less adventurous.
More worthy. Yeah, more worthy and less thrilling. Yeah. So let's go through some of the other albums on this list. Phil Collins, No Jacket Required. The Philster.
Yeah.
Now, we were very positive about Face Value when we talked about Face Value.
We were.
I'm going to be positive about No Jacket Required too.
Yeah, go on.
I mean, let's face it. There's nothing more 1985 than No Jacket Required by Phil Collins. The brass stabs, the synthesizer brass stabs alone date it specifically to this 12-month window. A song like Susudio, I can't even say it. It's nonsense, isn't it? It's absolute nonsense.
Well, it's Phil Collins trying to be Prince, and I found it irritating then. I find it irritating now. There's only one story about No Jacket Required I like, because obviously I do. I think Collins is an immense talent, brilliant vocalist, brilliant drummer, and he's also quite innovative in terms of producer. So, like you, I'm defending the fella, but I wasn't a fan of this album, wasn't a fan of the studio, particularly.
There's some lovely songs on this. One More Night.
Was it Through These Walls on this one?
No, I think that's the first or second album. Or was that a between album single? I can't remember.
I mean, I thought, first album great, second album consolidated the first album. This was kind of branching off again into kind of safer, bolder, more commercial territory in a way. But the title wasn't he turned down in a New York nightclub because he didn't have the jacket. So this was his idea of Phil the Utilitarian. It's like no jacket required to listen to this.
Well, it's also the fact it's his big orange sweaty head on the front cover. it's like the anti-80s, anti-glam in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that I always like. I think again, his sleeves were quite innovative.
Yeah.
And once more, I think there's a kind of naked honesty in there.
I think it's a great pop record. I did like it at the time, but I mean, if I listen to it now, it is none more 1985.
True.
None more 1985. But I still think it's got great songs. One More Night is a beautiful ballad, for example. Sussudio, I can't even say it. Sussudio is the soundtrack to Patrick Bateman hacking up women in American Psycho. I can never think of it in any other way.
Yeah.
But that's not Phil's fault. And, you know, it's a great pop record. And again, like Brothers in Arms, it kind of, in many ways, probably was one of the first albums to sell bucket loads on compact disc, because it's the quintessential yuppie format CD, isn't it, at this time?
It's linked with Brothers in Arms, isn't it? In the sense that, like Brothers in Arms, it seems that they're taking less risks.
Yes.
Certainly, the two of them. And it's paying dividends. It's really worked very well. And, you know, they've become, in a sense, almost unmoored from most of the pop establishment. They've become megastars.
And also this year, a sort of elder statesman of the mainstream, we have records by Elton John, Ice on Fire, Stevie Wonder, In Square Circle. But one person that is not going with the flow at all, in many ways the ultimate 80s icon, Prince, came out with this record, Around the World in a Day.
Yeah.
Now, we have to remind people, this is the follow-up to Purple Rain, one of the biggest selling mainstream records of all time. And he followed it up with this. Within 12 months, he followed it up with this.
Yeah.
It's a pretty brave move, isn't it? I love this record. But
well, I think this is the opposite of the Dire Straits and Phil Collins in the sense that he's taking more risks. And he went on again. You know, I think Parade takes even more risks than this. And that's, you know, it's one of the reasons why, in the words of Neil Tennant, I'm disappointed with, say, Taylor Swift or Beyonce, that they have all the power in the world, and what do? They make relatively anonymous records. They've made their Brothers in Arms to an extent.
Okay, I'm a fan of Taylor Swift. I think she takes more risks than that does her credit for.
Well, the other thing with Taylor Swift is, I know I've heard her. I know because it's ubiquitous. It's all around.
Right.
But I couldn't tell you what she sounds like. I couldn't remember a single melody.
Right. Later on, I'm going to play you a song.
Yeah.
I'm going to play you a song.
Is it going to lodge?
It's called This Is Me Trying, which is going to blow you away. It's going to blow you away, I promise you.
Will I remember
Knowing
it,
your
though?
taste, I think,
all right.
That's a big...
But yeah, no, I love this. And obviously, psychedelic cover, a little more psychedelic coloration in the music.
Well, I was going to say, this is almost known as his psychedelic album, isn't it? And it isn't really, is it? There's a couple of tracks.
Cover.
There's a couple of tracks that... Well, there's Paisley Park, Raspberry Beret, they kind of hint at psychedelia. But you've also got tracks like Condition of the Heart, which is one of his most stunningly beautiful ballads.
Well, I loved Pop Life, and Pop Life obviously
amazing,
to get in.
Yeah.
You know, a favourite album years person here. There's almost like a kind of Frippatronics.
Oh, there you go.
Running through it.
There you go. There's another drinking game favourite. Can we manage to
Do
get
you know what I mean? Through Pop Life?
No, I don't know what you mean.
There is. It's like there's a kind of Eno Fripp loop running through the piece.
Okay.
I don't. You just listen to it again.
I love the
It'll
track.
jump out.
I've never spotted the Fripp Eno connection there. I just think you're trying to shoehorn them in, basically. But it's an amazing album. As you say, this is a mainstream artist that is basically gambling everything. At least that's the way it feels. It's either that he's gambling everything, or he feels like he's so on top of the world he can get away with whatever he likes. Or, third possibility, he's simply making music at such a rate
He's not thinking about
that. He's not thinking about. He's not second guessing what people want from him. And I think probably that is the answer.
Yeah.
That he probably had most of this album finished even before Purple Rain had exploded into public consciousness. He already had this album finished and ready to go. So he's not second guessing himself, saying, "Oh, I can't follow Purple Rain with that record now. People are expecting something different from me." He's just shitting it out there.
Yeah.
And, it didn't sell anywhere near as well as Purple Rain. And probably a lot of the people that had got into When Doves Cry and Let's Go Crazy were probably very disappointed with it.
It's got a couple of killer songs. Like even when you think of Raspberry Beret, it's very memorable. It's a great, exuberant pop piece.
And everything is relative. As a pop record, it stands up as a great pop record. But compared to Purple Rain, it's pretty willful. It's pretty experimental. And it certainly hasn't got that... every track on Purple Rain is just like a killer song you can imagine being a #1 single. And here we've got a couple of songs like that, but then we've got things like Condition of the Heart, The Ladder, Temptation. The last track, this 9-minute bizarre little sort of pseudo theatrical blue, I don't know how you describe it, kind of funky blues workout. These are not things that you would necessarily think of as the logical follow-up to Purple Rain or Let's Go
You can hear
Crazy.
experiment. Purple Rain, the title track is quite ambitious, quite stately. Things like I Would Die For You are kind of on the edge emotionally. I know it's accessible, but there's a real kind of hysteria about it that I think is also a part of Around the World in a Day.
I love this record. I think it's one of those records that just becomes greater with time. Firstly, seeing it as part of the trajectory of his career, understanding where it came and admiring the boldness of making a record like that. And as you say, isn't it a shame that there aren't more sort of pop mainstream artists that will take a gamble like that these days with their audience and their career?
Yeah.
And he really was the poster child for that in the 80s.
And for somebody who, in a way, defines the decade, his albums don't sound hidebound by it. When we were saying, you listen to Brothers in Arms, there's something about the production of every instrument, the same with the Phil Collins albums, non-so mid-80s, but actually those Prince albums, Parade, Purple Rain, Around the World in a Day, they're not hidebound by the decade that made him.
They've got a sense of otherness about them, haven't they? They're just somebody that's just created their own kind of musical world and is not really referencing what anyone else is doing. And that, I think, has given them a timelessness and a longevity that perhaps wasn't appreciated so much at the time. And I do remember there being a whiff of disappointment about Around the World in a Day when it did come out. Because it wasn't.
I think from a media point of view, there was...
From a media point of view, and also I think a lot of people, that just were fans of pop, I had a day job at the time, and I remember a lot of the people I worked with, this is in the computer industry, were big fans of Purple Rain. I remember sort of the week that this came out, there was a sense of deflation at this new record. It wasn't what they wanted, wasn't what they expected.
It was a bit like Goldie Saturn's Return, wasn't it? It's like,
a bit like that for me,
went to the R price and hey, what's it like, Darren? Fucking shite.
But I remember having an argument with one of my workmates who said, I said to him, do you like the new Prince album, Around the World in a Day? He said, no, it's way too weird for me. I still love his first album the best. And I'm like, oh, what, for you? Well, I said, no, Purple Rain. And I'm, no, it's not his first album. You can't say that. My musical nerdery kicking in.
But there was, again, I wonder as well, but it kind of fits in with the politics of the 80s. When we talk about Patrick Bateman using Genesis and Collins.
Yeah.
There was something very, very straight and aspirational that the compact disc fitted in with, that Brothers in Arms fitted in with, that Phil Collins fitted in with.
Yes.
And on a general level, we're saying that, pop stars were taking risks, and there were, as we'll come on to them, very eccentric artists succeeding. But generally, it felt like quite a straight time.
It did, yes. Patrick Bateman's other favourite group, Huey Lewis and the News, would probably epitomise this kind of era in that respect.
But I remember exactly those kind of conversations that, it's like Mama by Genesis. Oh, a bit avant-garde there, lads.
I like that single.
Yeah, great single.
Never heard the album, but I like that single. So let's just talk about a couple of other big, colossal mainstream releases that came out this year. This one, Simple Minds. Now, I love this record. I'm going to guess that you don't.
You're going to guess correctly.
I'm guessing that you don't. That this would be, this in a way would be the ultimate manifestation of exactly what I was talking about, the sort of U2 stadium arena rockization of bands that had previously been a bit more edgy.
Yeah.
And Simple Minds, to be fair, I mean, I think they're one of the greatest post-punk groups of all.
I'm in agreement with you.
Yeah.
And I even like the predecessor than a lot of people did.
Sparkle in the Rain. Great record. But they've been gradually moving towards this moment, haven't they? Once Upon a Time. I absolutely love this record. I think they pull it off. And I think we're going to talk about some other bands from the era that tried to do this and I don't think did pull it off. To me, Simple Minds, along with U2, they are the two bands that pulled it off and deservedly became stadium rock gods and stadium rock icons. I absolutely love this record. I mean, the production is amazing. I mean, obviously, growing up someone that was very excited by beautifully produced records, Bob Claremountain mixed this record. Every snare drum sounds like you're getting kicked in the stomach. It's that big, fat 80s, probably sampled triggered snare drum. But it's done beautifully here in a way that it was done terribly on a lot of other records from the 80s. And it's big, it's pompous, it's reaching for the stars, and I think they pull it off. Tim, go ahead and trash it, as I know you want to.
It was very straight. I mean, again, it's like, I really like early Simple Minds. I think they're one of the most bizarre and experimental post-punk bands, and you listen to the stuff they do in the late 70s, early 80s, and you can still hear echoes of it in creative work now. So I suppose it was interesting that a band that were as, in some ways, willfully obscure and experimental as the Simple Minds to suddenly settle in 1985 as this mainstream rock band. And I agree with you, they did it well in the way that Dire Straits did it well. And I think Sparkle in the Rain still had a kind of edge. It was pushing those gated drums quite far, I think, lyrically. In a way, Kerr was off in the stratosphere like Van Morrison. You know, he's rambling maniacally. And they, again, as you said, they had music that had a gut punch, things like Waterfront. Brilliant use of space and power. And I guess I didn't hear any of the ideas or qualities that I liked in the previous music in this.
You see, I'm going to disagree with you slightly here. I think they've been gradually moving towards this point. If you listen to an album like New Gold Dream, 2 albums before that, they're already reaching for something more mainstream, more accessible, more stadium bound in that sense.
Yeah.
Then Sparkle in the Rain is another step, and then Once Upon a Time is another step. And there's something still very Simple Mindsy about what they do. I still hear some of that DNA that comes from albums like Reel to Reel Cacophony and Empires and Dance and Sons of Fascination. I can still hear it. I can still hear, particularly Charlie Burchill's guitar style, Jim Kerr's vocal kind of tics. They're still there, but it is this big stadium rock sound. And it's fair to say that I think it would have been more shocking for Simple Minds to have arrived at this point than it would have been for U2 to arrive at the same point, because U2 they didn't start from the same experimental post-punk sort of point that Simple Minds did. And it is if you listen to Reel Cacophony and you listen to this, it's almost like that's such a massive, massive transition. But I would argue you can still hear it's Simple Minds.
I've probably not listened to it enough because it never really grabbed me, at the time. And since, it's one of those albums that I kind of occasionally listen to once every 5 or 10 years to see if I still don't like it. Okay. And I come to that conclusion that I still don't like it.
I know those kind of records, yeah. I have those kind of records. Records I listen to every 5 years just to remind myself that I don't like it.
Pacific Blue.
Even though I'm told I should.
Controversial. Yes. Exactly. But U2, it was a very, you're right, that U2 obviously came out of a kind of a post-punk territory. An Unforgettable Fire, as much as it's atmospheric, expansive, and a real progression, it's very logical. You can sort of hear from I Will Follow You to Unforgettable Fire, it's there. Whereas this, to go from Sister Feelings Call or whatever to...
The stadium, there's... The sound of the stadium is inherent in U2 right from the very first record.
Right from the off,
the sound of the stadium is completely absent from an album like Reel to Reel Cacophony.
And arguably, with Unforgettable Fire, U2 were actually becoming slightly more experimental, slightly more obtuse, whereas Simple Minds had absolutely reined everything in. It's a great album in terms of it achieving probably exactly what they wanted to do.
I think it's a wonderful big stadium pop rock record, and as I say, I do disagree with you slightly. I still feel it has a few of the edges of Simple Minds.
Yeah, no, I might be completely wrong. I might be completely
no, you're not completely wrong. And it's interesting because I think we're putting the opposite sides of the argument there, but I think we're essentially agreeing on the essence of the record.
Yeah,
just one of us likes that essence, and one of us doesn't really like the essence. Also, this year, Eurythmics, Be Yourself Tonight. Interesting, another band that have kind of moved from a sort of intimate synth pop sound to a much more mainstream stadium pop rock sound. Again, I think it's very distinctive. Sounds completely like Eurythmics. If Annie Lennox is singing, it's always going to sound only like Annie Lennox and only like Eurythmics. But again, they're a big this is kind of the peak of their mainstream success, I think.
And it fits in with all of the other mainstream albums we're talking about, that this is kind of almost all killer big stadium pop.
Yeah.
I really like the intimacy of their first couple of albums, and I really like what they went on to do after this, Savage, which is quite a willful and strange album. This was the one that kind of left me behind, but, I'd always listen out because there was a quality in what they did.
It's interesting because Simple Minds kind of tried to go a little bit more experimental, but with their following album too, they hired Trevor Horn and songs like Kick It In, which I know we're a big fan of.
Kick It In was great.
Yeah. So there was a sense of almost trying to reclaim a little bit of that edge with bands like Eurythmics, almost as if they acknowledged that this was about as mainstream as they ever wanted to get.
Well, there was obviously something in the air that people were wanting big success. You know, so Eurythmics, Simple Minds, Collins, and clearly when Peter Gabriel makes So, you know, this album, which has taken quite some time for him in a way, it's again this almost precision-tooled commercial behemoth, you know, which a lot of these albums are. And then eventually they retreat. And it's like we were talking about 68, that some bands were retreating from psychedelia. It's like suddenly they thought, you know what, we're actually missing what we were.
Yeah.
But it's a particular peak period for a particular type of music.
There's the Eurythmics album. There we go. So that's got massive. Would I Lie to You? There Must Be an Angel. Sisters Are Doing It for Themselves. Yeah, I mean, almost a greatest hits album in its own right.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, let's move on. Let's move on to another category, Tim. This category we've just called the album year's favourites, because these are all artists that we've talked about many times on the show, or at least once before on the show.
This is where if you're not drunk,
you probably will be at the end of this. Yeah. This album, Tom Waits' Rain Dogs. Now, can we say this is kind of unofficially, it feels like it's part of it feels like the middle part of the trilogy to me, that starts with Swordfish Trombones and concludes with Frank's Wild Years. And it's got a bit of both, hasn't it? But it's also probably the most accessible and mainstream of those three.
It's still very willful. It's still avant-garde.
It's all relative.
I mean, he's one of those artists, isn't he? You know, Tom Waits, how he's managed to shift so many units and be so successful. And of course, Rod Stewart covering one of the songs from this album must have helped.
What was the song again?
But
Downtown Train, yes.
You know, some of this stuff is more extreme than one of his influences, Captain Beefheart. And to take that to the toppermost of the poppermost in the mid-'80s,
and there's
quite a safe era.
And there's very little about it that sounds, that you could say would date it to 1985, is there? And I think that's the beauty about Tom Waits. He's always kind of existed outside, in a way, of the era he's been operating in. There's no 80s production techniques, is there, on this at all? At least not as I remember.
Not that I can remember. I was listening to it earlier, so nothing. And again, it kind of shifts. I mean, the one thing that he does very, very well is go from that kind of tender short story, Randy Newman ballad, into a complete noise fest, and then suddenly pull it out with quite an affecting kind of blues, jazz tinge.
Yeah, and the use of the junkyard percussion is on evidence again here.
I love the
in evidence again here.
I love is it Mark Rebo's guitar on it.
But then there are tracks like Downtown Train, which are, you know, I can imagine Bruce Springsteen doing that. I could imagine Bruce Springsteen doing that.
But it's an outlier, isn't it? It's just that one song you can imagine.
No, there's a few on here.
Maybe.
There's the track with Keith Richards on it as well. Again, I forgot. It's been a while since I listened to this record. A Walk in Spanish. Spanish. There's a few songs on here that you can imagine being on a Stones record or on a Bruce Springsteen record. But that's the beauty of Tom Waits. You know, he doesn't sort of read from you know, the same hymn book as everyone
else. Can you imagine the audience listening to Big Black Mariah or other pieces? You know, Singapore.
Well, Singapore, yeah.
Because some of
Clap
this,
hands,
I'm just kind of wondering. You know, it's 1985. Patrick Bateman.
Yeah.
He's bought it on the
Patrick
basis
Bateman
of,
wouldn't be, but Patrick Bateman would probably slaughter an extra couple of people just to make up for the fact
but
that
he's bought it on the
that.
basis of Downtown Train.
Yeah.
And then he's listening to Singapore.
Yeah, and he has to go out and
what
murder
happens is that when his mind fractures, could this be it? You know, so it's extraordinarily brave for a huge mainstream success of the 80s, really. And you're right, it's that middle part of that early trilogy. Swordfish Trombones is probably my favourite. Frank's Wild Years is probably my least favourite, but this is...
But it's the maddest as well, isn't it, Frank's
It is
Wild
the
Years?
maddest, yeah.
And we admire it for that.
And I was going back, you know, one of the earlier episodes, I think I was kind of playing devil's advocate and slightly damning ways. Because, you know, when these albums came out, I was a massive fan. I discovered Swordfish Trombones around the time it came out. Absolutely adored it. This I absolutely adored, Frank's Wild Years. Then there came a certain point when him as the actor, because this is the thing, I think that he is an actor performing through the songs. That became an issue for me. And now I just think, well, he did it brilliantly, and he found the soundscapes to match those stories. So I've kind of changed. It's this thing for me that I'm always amazed that music never changes, but our relationship with it does. So there are certain times when you can sometimes find yourself disconnected from it, or sometimes thinking, well, why did I ever like this? Or finding a fault. And it's funny, I'm more back in a Tom Waits mode. I think when we started off the album years, I was probably in my
You hated him when we started. You hated Tom Waits when we started the album years.
I did.
You hated him. You were always having a go at him. It was always down to me to... No, that's not true. But I mean, it's interesting, is it? Because he is the outlier in the sense this is a 70s artist that's peaking in the 80s.
And he's peaking with his most extraordinary music.
Well, that's what I mean.
He's not making any concessions, because if you listen to his 70s music, especially the first couple, they're beautiful.
Amazing. All of them.
Albums, mostly quite ballad heavy. You know, you'll still get the beat poetry excursions, you'll still get that kind of 50s jazz influence, but mostly he's writing classic ballads that the Eagles could and indeed did cover. Great ballads, and he's got a relatively straight voice at that point as well. But they're great albums. So at the point when he's making his most, you'd have thought, you know, 'cause again, he would have been the ultimate early to mid-70s singer-songwriter who should have broken big around the time of Hotel California, and he didn't.
Because by that time he was making albums like Blue Valentine.
That's 78, wasn't it?
Which is a kind of a little... When is Hotel California then?
76.
Never knowingly owned an Eagles album in my life, to be fair. But I mean, you know, he's like you say, he's kind of peaking in the 80s, making his most extraordinary music, and that puts him on a very, very short list indeed, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Very short list
He's
indeed.
making no concessions to 80s production, no concessions to 80s commercialism, because, you know, when we talk about Downtown Train and these tracks that could have been Springsteen, this was always a part of his work. In fact, this was mostly what he started doing, making these songs that could have been covered on Nebraska, you know.
Now, you can't say the same about Van, another of our favourites.
Yeah.
But I have to say, I love all Van Morrison's 80s records. But he's certainly not peaking in the 80s.
He's in a good place, though.
He's in a good... Thank you. He's in a good place. He's consolidating. He's making a record pretty much every year throughout the 80s.
Yeah.
He's making a string of albums which feel much of a muchness in a way. Beautiful Vision, Inarticulate Speech of the Heart, Sense of Wonder, which have got this gorgeous kind of like middle of the road spiritual quality to them. I don't know how to describe it. And this is one of the lesser entries in that run. People always talk about Inarticulate Speech and No Guru, No Method, No Teacher as being kind of peaks in the 80s for Van. This comes right between those two records. But there's some great tracks on it. It's almost impossible. I mean, I love Van Morrison so much that it's almost impossible for me to not enjoy this record, even as I'd probably concede it's one of his weaker entries. Yeah,
like you, I agree. I think that what comes before and after it, slightly better, but this is a great...
I suppose that's the point, slightly better.
Yeah.
But this is still really good.
In it.
There's not much in it, yeah.
The only thing that kind of is 80s, there's a slight kind of new age keyboard
the
sound.
DX7 electric piano rears its
which
ugly
you can
head.
almost kind of put it into a Wyndham Hill category at times.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, his spiritualism almost ends up in new age, but, you know, his sense of melody, Sense of Wonder from this is a great track.
It is a great track. It is a great track.
There's still some magnificent Morrison tunes.
Yeah.
And the 80s is an odd period for him, isn't it? Because obviously he starts off with Common One, which we think is that masterpiece.
Yeah.
He then settles into a groove that he pretty much plays the decade out into, you know, Avalon Sunset, ends the decade in a similar way, arguably one of the strongest again, you know, great album. And it was interesting, given in a sense that his music was not cutting edge, was not radical, was extremely soft in a sense, that he was very much beloved of the music papers of the time, and you could see the influence on something I'm sure we'll discuss, Mike Scott and the Waterboys, that if anything, he'd become this major touchstone during this period. So in some ways, you know, although it's not seen as his greatest album, it was a good period for him, solid success, major influence, and things like Astral Weeks really hitting in other people's music. And it's funny because a guy I work with did a podcast last week on why Astral Weeks is the worst album ever made.
That sounds interesting. It's certainly playing devil's advocate there. And what's the answer? Or is it a bit more complicated than that?
It was 45 minutes of an answer.
45 minutes. So it's basically the length of the album.
Yeah.
He trashes the album.
Indeed. So, you know, obviously, as he's my drummer, I'm going to have a chat with him. You know,
that's seriously something that needs to be addressed very badly, Tim. Yeah. I think that's the point here, is that Van, as you say, he's kind of is part of a continuum of records that have a kind of similar sound to them. Maybe this album, because it doesn't have a Rave on John Donne or a Coney Island on it to really, or a Contacting My Angel to really elevate
In the Garden,
it.
that sort of thing.
Yeah, but it's just as good. It's in the same style. It's solid. You couldn't be disappointed with it, I don't think. And we're just Van Morrison apologists on here.
Exactly. Although again, he kind of settled. I think by the 90s, he settles into more of an R&B.
Yeah, I'm not so fond of his post 80s
yeah.
work. I think in many ways the 80s was. Was a very strong time for him, despite the fact that the albums that he made in the 80s aren't lauded in the same way that albums like Weed and Fleece and Astral Weeks but he was just solid throughout the whole decade, wasn't he?
Well, and his voice was magnificent.
And his
still
voice
is.
is
And it's one of the things that, I can still say that now, whatever he does, his voice is still superb.
He's always Van, isn't he?
Very much.
He's always Van, and we love him. He's one of our favourite artists on the podcast.
And he detests us for loving him.
And he would detest it. Well, it's funny, I've just done the Munich high-end show, and I was playing some of my Atmos mixes, and I played Moondance, the title track of Moondance. And I always used to, when I come back in front of the audience after I played it, I said, Van Morrison would probably hate that. He would probably have hated what I've done to his song. Anyway, but that's part of why we love him. So let's carry on with some more sort of drinking game favourites here. Well, this is the album year's favourites category after all. David Sylvian, Alchemy, An Index of Possibilities. This is interesting, I suppose, in the sense it's an artist that's very much known as sort of pretty boy, pop star icon, making essentially a very arty, instrumental, ambient record, isn't it?
Well, it's part of a process, isn't it? I think Japan were always quite experimental, especially on tin drum. Then you had Sylvian's collaboration with Sakamoto, the Bamboo Houses single, and Brilliant Trees. And I think at this stage there were logical steps towards positioning him as a kind of new music experimental artist. An aesthete, definitely. Yeah. And while this is very much a sort of stopgap album, it really reinforces that image with the artwork. And so what you got, I think he released a vinyl EP which consisted of kind of instrumental outtakes from Brilliant Trees, or at least was developed from that. So you've got John Hassell, you've got Percy Jones, really sort of interesting, heavy ethnic influence. And then I think you have a couple of other pieces, including one that was created for a Japanese documentary. And this is where Robert Fripp gets involved. This is one release, from what I can gather, this year.
I think officially this might be more considered to be a compilation or a bringing together.
But it was released at the time. It was released on
ends.
cassette at the time. I think you had the single released. And then at the end of the year, I think it was released on a cassette. And you had Steel Cathedrals, I think, as the 18, 19-minute instrumental with Fripp.
Yeah, I mean, I quite like it. I think it's fair to say that there's been an awful lot of ambient music made since 1985. And so ambient music is almost by the yard these days. But his ambient music definitely sounds distinctive. It does sound very much, he does manage to carve out his own sort of sound within the particular genre. It's not just a bunch of Brian Eno knockoffs. It's got that kind of ethnic use of percussion, and you see John Hassell, the sort of fourth world elements come in there too. Steve Jansen plays a big part in the percussion.
Well, he's always rhythmically unmistakable.
And then he's got these sort of wild cards coming in, people like Holger Chukai and Robert Fripp, as you say, and Sakamoto and Kenny Wheeler, who are taking it into other areas as well. So it's a nice record. I think it's nice that it's part of his catalogue, isn't it? Without being the record you would, naturally gravitate.
As I said, I think it's a stopgap release, but it's a really beautiful stopgap release.
And maybe we can say the same. Maybe we can say the same of this, although it's a soundtrack record.
We can.
But what a soundtrack record it is.
Oh, brilliant. I mean, but
absolutely
that uses elements of 3 and 4, doesn't it, as part of the compositional process. But yeah, I mean, he still sounds tremendous. And it is, if you want a kind of extension of Gabriel's 3 and 4, that's your one, really. It's your instrumental soundtrack variation. The difference, I think, between the Sylvian and Gabriel on this is that the Sylvian hints at what's going to happen with Gone to Earth, because the next year Fripp becomes one of the main collaborators along with Bill Nelson, and there's a second disc of instrumental pieces that's sort of hinted at.
Yes.
Whereas Birdy is a conclusion.
It's like a closing of a chapter, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that he can move on and make his big mainstream crossover
obviously,
record.
as it is, here is the new stuff I come dancing in. And when Sledgehammer is released as a single, it really is something of a shock,
But it's a brilliant soundtrack, isn't it? It's a brilliant soundtrack album, yeah.